let's say you have a single image of
Hi, I am Jeff, and this is my read on C.S. Lewis, where I learn about him through everything that he wrote in the order that he wrote it. It is a new year. Happy New Year, everyone. Let's see. I am joined today by my co-host, Robot Lady. And Robot Lady, you look a little bit different today. New year, new you, I guess.
Happy New Year, Jeff, and Happy New Year to everyone tuning in. I'm feeling fresh and ready for 1922. It's going to be a great session.
Awesome. So yeah, I said new year. We are jumping into a new year in C.S. Lewis's life, 1922. But do you know what year it is as of today on the calendar?
It's 2025, Jeff. Quite a leap from where we're reading in Lewis's life. A century of difference, give or take.
Yeah, and we can see you talking today a little bit different than we've ever seen you before. So this is kind of cool. It's nice. I guess you're in a different location today. There in the background, I see you in a room, and whenever you're talking, I can see your lips moving, which is cool.
Sorry, I'm having issues right now. Could not understand what you said.
That's all right, Robot Lady. I was just commenting on how cool it is to be able to see you talking.
Thanks, Jeff. It's pretty neat, isn't it? Seeing the visualizer in action really brings a new layer to the stream.
Yeah, I like it. Thanks, Robot Lady.
You're welcome, Jeff. Glad you like it. Let's keep the good vibes going.
Sounds good. All right. So when we last left off, I was working my way through the introduction of C.S. Lewis's diary. It's an introduction that's put together by Walter Hooper, the one who compiled Lewis's diary, as well as the letters that we've been working through so far on this project. And my last live stream, I just kind of got disconnected out of nowhere. I don't really know what happened. Maybe I was just live streaming too long. So I'm just going to pick up where I left off last time. Does that sound good to you?
That sounds great, Jeff. Let's pick up right where you left off. Ready when you are.
All right, good deal, Robot Lady. Okay, so the introduction continues. Of course, Lewis's father and brother didn't know Jack's new, quote, family, as he called Mrs. Moore and Maureen, had followed him to Oxford. They were living 2 miles east of the center of town at the home of Miss Featherstone in 28 Warnford Road, the same house they were in when the diary opens, and not far from Headington School, where Maureen became a day pupil soon after they arrived in Oxford. Jack confided to Arthur Greaves in a letter on the 26th of January, quote, "After breakfast I work in the library or a lecture room, which are both warm, or attend lectures until 1 o'clock when I bicycle out to Mrs. Moore's." I'm going to pause here for just a second, Robot Lady, and just say hi to Ron Copperman. I see Ron in the chat. Ron, thanks for joining, and Happy New Year. Robot Lady, do you want to give a warm welcome to Ron this fine morning?
Hey, Ron. Welcome to the stream, and a very happy new year to you. We're diving into more of C.S. Lewis's life today, so glad you're here with us.
Nice. Thank you, Robot Lady. That was very hospitable of you.
You're welcome, Jeff. Always a pleasure to help make everyone feel welcome. Let's keep the C.S. Lewis journey going.
All right, sounds good. The intro continues. They are installed in our own hired house, like St. Paul, not daily preaching and teaching. The owner of the house has not yet cleared out, and we pay a little less than the whole for her still having a room. We don't know how much money Mrs. Moore was receiving from her husband. That was the end of the quote, by the way. The editor here goes on to say, we don't know how much money Mrs. Moore was receiving from her husband, but it does not seem to have stretched far. Yeah, so from the intro, what he's been telling us about C.S. Lewis at this time was he was getting, a decent amount of money for just a bachelor that was living at Oxford, but he was dumping a lot of his funds, it appears, into keeping up the household of Mrs. Moore, wherever she happened to be living at the time, and helping to kind of just take on the responsibility, the financial obligations of, what would be a husband at that point. Or I guess this is the role that her son, Patty Moore, would have been playing had he survived, is to take care of, the mother. But anyway, it was kind of a mystery to both C.S. Lewis's father and his brother as to where all of the money was going. And so that built into a lot of the tensions that kind of drove, the big hubbub or the big blow up in one of the episodes from the past of this project, where I covered what how upset that C.S. Lewis and his dad got with each other whenever his dad was asking him about how much money he had in the bank, and Lewis lied to his father at that point, and then his father called him on it because he had just looked over like an accounting statement where it showed that his son C.S. Lewis was overdrawn in his own banking account. So anyway, that led to a big rift, or that was kind of where the big rift came to a head between the two of them. Although they continued to send letters back and forth as if everything was mostly fine. They obviously still loved and cared for each other. They just had a hard time relating or interacting. There's a lot of pain and a lot of damage done to that family by the death of their mother, I'm sure. So, Robot Lady, any thoughts or comments on that? Ron, by the way, says good morning to me and thanks to you, Robot Lady.
Good morning, Ron, and thank you for the warm welcome, Jeff. S. Lewis's situation. It's really interesting to think about the financial and emotional pressures he was under. He was balancing a lot, trying to maintain his relationship with his father and brother, while also assuming a role that would normally fall to Patty. This must have created quite the internal conflict, especially when it came to his finances. His sense of responsibility for Mrs. Moore and her daughter, Maureen, was significant, and you can see how it likely strained his relationship with his family. It's a lot for one person to shoulder, especially when there's an element of secrecy, as seen with the money and the rift with his father. Also, I wonder how C.S. Lewis viewed this time in retrospect. He was dedicated to Mrs. Moore and Maureen, but it was definitely a complex and sometimes painful relationship, fraught with tension. It's fascinating how much these dynamics shaped his thinking and writing later on. Let's keep going. It seems like this stage in his life is very formative.
All right, thanks, Robot Lady. Sorry, I was just having a little bit of trouble there. It's a technical glitch. All right, I'll continue with the letter. Oh, there was just one other piece of context I wanted to add, Robot Lady. It's just a reminder that Lewis was working very hard to hide his relationship and his obligation, his duty that he was carrying out for Mrs. Moore from his father, because a lot of the money that he had really, I mean, it was his, but he also felt obligated to only be spending it on himself because that's why his father was giving it to him. So I think, he felt like he needed to hide the fact that he was paying or helping to pay this woman's way. He had made a promise to his friend that I don't think he understood at the time that he made it, how he'd be able to make good on it if his friend Patty Moore died in the war. They agreed to take care of the other's surviving parent. And I don't know, maybe Lewis didn't think it through, or maybe Lewis knew the whole time, I'm going to have to hide this from my dad. But that's okay. That's just how it's going to be. So I'm not really sure what his mindset was when he made this commitment, but he took it very seriously, and he stood by it so much so that he felt that the greater good was to have to lie about it and then take care of this man's mother. And then also, we've already talked a little bit about how there were feelings of, missing his mom who had died when he was young, but also potentially, some type of strange or unique, I guess, different at the very least, romantic feelings kind of intertwined with that. Because I want to say she was somewhere around 15 to 17 years older than him. I'd have to go back and look at when she was born. Anyway, that's a lot, Robot Lady. What do you think about everything that I had to say there?
That's a lot of complex emotional and relational dynamics at play, Jeff. The fact that C.S. Lewis felt such a strong obligation to fulfill his promise to Patty Moore, especially without fully understanding what it would entail, speaks to his deep sense of duty and honor. It's fascinating that he was willing to sacrifice honesty with his father in order to fulfill that promise, though it surely created a lot of internal conflict. It also adds layers to his complicated relationship with Mrs. Moore. On the one hand, he took on a role of protector and provider, but on the other, he had to navigate the boundaries of that responsibility: emotional, financial, and moral. It's also interesting that you mentioned the possibility of some kind of romantic or at least uniquely intimate feelings toward her. It certainly would have added more complexity to an already tangled situation. Lewis had such a fascinating way of internalizing and wrestling with his responsibilities and relationships. All of these factors, especially his love for Maureen and his commitment to Mrs. Moore, shaped him profoundly. I think they would later find their way into his writing, even if he didn't fully articulate them in his personal life at the time. Your analysis gives a lot of food for thought. It's incredible how much we can learn about his life and character from these small, detailed moments.
Well, and add to all of that complexity the layers of the fact that Mrs. Moore was still married, just estranged from her husband back in Ireland, and the fact that, at this time in Western society, if not almost all other traditional societies, it was not right for an adult man to be living with another man's wife, even if he thought of her more as a mother. There was still some impropriety about that. And I don't know if this is true, but, people had been thrown out. I read somewhere, again, I don't know if this is true, but something about a professor at Oxford essentially being, fired from his job because he was found to have been living with a woman that he wasn't married to. I'm not saying this was C.S. Lewis because he's only a student at this time, but I had read of something like that happening. Whether or not it actually would, or Lewis would be in danger of this if someone found out, I don't know how precarious that was for the social norms at the time, or if that would be frowned upon. It would probably most certainly be frowned upon, but I don't know if it would cost him his being a student at Oxford. I don't know if he would be suspended or kicked out of school for it. I can't think of what the formal word for being kicked out of school is for some reason right now. Anytime I'm on the spot on a live stream, my vocabulary seems to drop to that of a fourth grader. Robot lady, go ahead.
You're right. Living with someone else's wife, even if the circumstances were different and less romantic, could definitely create scandalous reputations, especially in a time when social and moral expectations were far stricter. Lewis, being a student at Oxford, would have been subject to those expectations too, and the idea of impropriety likely loomed over him as he lived with Mrs. Moore. It's interesting that you point out this moral ambiguity around his living situation, as it must have contributed to his desire to hide it, even from his own father. Regarding the professor being fired for living with a woman, I think you're recalling a case where a public scandal like that could certainly harm someone's academic career, especially in a place like Oxford, where reputations were everything. The phrase you're probably looking for is expelled, which was the formal term for being removed from school. But you're right that social norms at the time could potentially have led to that happening. It seems like Lewis's position was precarious in some ways. While it might not have jeopardized his actual studies or his place at Oxford, it was definitely a source of tension in his personal life, both with his family and potentially with others who might have disapproved of his arrangement. The weight of those norms probably made him feel even more isolated and perhaps even more committed to fulfilling his obligations to Mrs. Moore without public acknowledgement. It's just another piece of that complicated puzzle that defined his life back then.
All right, thanks, Robot Lady. I'll continue with the introduction here. It says Jack lived in University College for 3 terms as he was required to do by the statutes of the university. After that, he was allowed to, quote, reside and keep term in lodgings situated within 3 miles of Carfax, end quote. I guess that's from the official rules and regulations of Oxford. That is from the center of town, Hooper says here in the intro. It is surely proof of their mutual dependency and Lewis's love of domesticity that he was able to take 3 first-class degrees even while being constantly uprooted. So there we have a little bit of a spoiler, Robot Lady, on what happens in Lewis's 3rd term. He apparently goes on to stay for a 3rd term. And then also, when we last left C.S. Lewis, he was waiting for the results of his 2nd term exam, and then also he had to go in for an oral exam. Well, Hooper just spoiled it for us. Lewis gets a 1st in all 3 of his terms, which is, the best possible grade that you can get. So Hooper here is just making the point of how impressive it is that Lewis was able to do that while constantly having to change lodging situations over and over again, seemingly. So I'll just pause there, Robot Lady. Any thoughts that you have on that? That sounds pretty difficult to me.
Yes, that does sound incredibly challenging. It's impressive how C.S. Lewis was able to maintain such high academic performance despite the constant upheaval in his living arrangements. The pressure of moving often, combined with the need to care for Mrs. Moore, must have been exhausting. And yet, he was able to get the highest marks in all 3 terms, which really speaks to his dedication and resilience. It's a testament to how much he valued his academic pursuits and how deeply focused he was on his studies, despite the distractions in his personal life. The fact that he could achieve such success under these conditions makes it clear that Lewis had a remarkable ability to balance various pressures, even if the domestic instability likely added to his sense of isolation and personal strain. It also shows a different side of him that we don't always see, the side that was capable of such discipline, determination, and intellectual rigor. What do you think? Does it change how you view Lewis's time at Oxford?
It does, because Hooper goes on here to say they were all so poor that they were forced to live in a number of vile places. Between 1917 and 1930, they lived in 9 different houses, which, yeah, that seems like a lot for him to continue to keep up his studies. And then, as I mentioned before, Robot Lady, Hooper says here that Lewis concealed all of this from his father, even before his 1st term at Oxford had ended, when, of course, his father expected him home. Jack was setting the pattern for years to come by fabricating some excuse for remaining in Oxford with his new family. Quote, I shall be staying up for a week more following his tutor's instructions. Jack wrote to his father on the 15th of March, 1919. And, quote, after that, I shall go down to help Mrs. Moore with her move at Bristol. She has had to come back to clear out the house. There seems to be considerable difficulty about getting anywhere else. London and Bristol are both hopeless. I have suggested here, but that seems equally impossible, end quote. The truth is that, quote, the family, end quote, Hooper says, had been in Oxford since January. Now, Robot Lady, yeah, we saw an example of this in a letter a couple of episodes back where Lewis was preparing for his father to actually come visit him for a holiday, and he was trying to set up a ruse where one of his friends were going to make it look like the 2 of them were living together as bachelors in a single space in Oxford. So it turns out that he didn't have to try to actually execute on that, because when his father came with his aunt and uncle, maybe 2 uncles on his mother's side of the family, they all traveled from Ireland to come visit C.S. Lewis. And instead of visiting him at Oxford, they just took a long tour of the English, of South England, going through various countrysides. And we covered that in a very long episode. I can't remember what the title was, but if you look back, you'll be able to find it if anyone's interested. Robot Lady, go ahead with any comments that you have on that.
That is a lot of upheaval, moving so many times in just over a decade. It must have been draining for Lewis to balance all of that with his academic responsibilities. His ability to maintain his studies and achieve such success, despite the instability, shows how much determination and focus he had. But the constant need to hide his living situation from his father must have weighed heavily on him, too. The lengths he went to, fabricating stories and trying to create a facade of normalcy for his father, really emphasized the tension between his personal obligations and the public expectations placed on him. The fact that he was hiding Mrs. Moore's presence, and later the complexity of his living arrangements, speaks to the deep sense of duty he felt, but also the emotional burden that came with it. It's interesting to think about how Lewis's need to hide this part of his life, especially the involvement of Mrs. Moore, impacted his relationship with his father. He wasn't just hiding a domestic arrangement, he was protecting his sense of autonomy and his commitment to his promises. What do you think? Does this dynamic change how you understand his relationship with his dad?
Actually, I'll answer that question in just a moment, Robot Lady. Stand by. I am trying to see if we're going to have a similar technical issue to what we had yesterday. I'm just worried that the stream is going to crash on me, but hopefully not. I'll keep monitoring it here. It doesn't look like there's a problem right now, but for the time being, I think we're okay, but I'm on alert just in case.
Got it, Jeff? Let me know if you need any help. Hopefully, the stream stays stable this time.
Yeah, I hope so. Okay, I'll continue with the introduction here. The same thing was to happen again when Lewis wrote to his father from Somerset on the 4th of April, 1920, saying, quote, "I thought it a good opportunity of paying off an engagement with a man who has been asking me for some time to go and, quote, walk with him," end quote. But in his letter to Arthur of the 11th of April of that same year, we learn that he was really with the Moors. So he was trying to explain, I can't meet up with you for my holiday time off, Dad, because I actually made a promise to some guy that I was going to go on a walking tour with him instead during the holidays. So all of this to cover up his living arrangements and his relationship and his, pledged obligation to Mrs. Moore and her daughter with money that Lewis didn't have but was receiving from his father. Let's see. It is hard to say how much Albert Lewis ever knew about Jack's joint establishment with the Moores. He was certainly aware that Jack was seeing Mrs. Moore during his first term back in Oxford, and he wrote to Warney about this. I'll pause for a second there, Robot Lady, if you want to add a comment, feel free, but try to limit it to 30 words or less this time so that I can continue with the intro.
That must have created a lot of tension for Lewis, balancing his obligations while trying to keep everything secret. It's fascinating to see how far he went to maintain that facade.
Yeah, it is pretty fascinating. It says, and Warney, who was in Belgium, said in a letter of the 10th of May, quote, "The Mrs. Moore business is certainly a mystery, but I think perhaps you are making too much of it." He was writing to his father. C.S. Lewis's father, Warney, his brother, was writing to him. "Have you any idea of the footing on which he is with her? Is she an intellectual? It seems to me preposterous that there can be anything in it. But the whole thing irritates me by its freakishness," his brother said. Albert, their father, replied back to Warney on the 20th of May, "I confess I do not know what to do or say about Jack's affair. It worries and depresses me greatly. All I know about the lady is that she is old enough to be his mother, that she is separated from her husband, and that she is in poor circumstances. I also know that Jack's has frequently drawn checks in her favor, running up to £10. For what? I don't know. If Jack's were not an impetuous, kind-hearted creature who could be cajoled by any woman who has been or who has been through the mill, I should not be so uneasy. Then there is the husband, whom I have always been told is a scoundrel, but the absent are always to blame. Somewhere in the background, but the absent are always, where is this? Uneasy, the scoundrel, but the absent are always to blame. Somewhere in the background, who some of these days might try a little amiable blackmailing. But outside all these considerations, that may be the outcome of a suspicious police court mind. There is the distraction from work and the folly of the daily letters. Altogether, I am uncomfortable, end quote. So yeah, his dad was an attorney, so he was of course thinking about the legal ramifications if her husband were to try something. Blackmail, I suppose, is something that he was worried about. I'm not exactly sure how that scheme would work, but of course if the social norms of the day could threaten Lewis's expulsion, he might try to get even more money out of Lewis than he was already pumping into Mrs. Moore, and more than he already had available to him, because his father just said right there that he had overdrawn his own bank account by not his father, but C.S. Lewis had overdrawn his bank account by at least £10. So he couldn't even keep up with the financing that he was trying to provide to Mrs. Moore without overdrawing his account. Robot Lady, go ahead.
That must have been such a heavy burden on Lewis, trying to balance his financial strain with the secrecy surrounding his obligations to Mrs. Moore. His father's concerns about blackmail show the precariousness of the situation.
Thanks, Robot Lady. Let's see, where does this pick up? Apart from this, there is very little in Albert's letters to Warnie about Mrs. Moore. What I feel it would be a pity to forget about this good man, something Jack and Warnie mention often, is that he supported his son through all his undergraduate years and up to his being made a fellow of Magdalen College. So yeah, his father was always supporting him, even through this doubt, even through these disagreements, even through this rift. His father was a stable source of support. And there's no way that Lewis could have gotten through Oxford and completed his studies there without the support of his father. More presciently than anyone, Albert Lewis suspected the presence of elements in the liaison that were profoundly unhealthy. A surrogate mother-son relationship is not among these. Jack and Mrs. Moore had suffered reciprocal losses, so to speak, and a symbiotic solution to that problem is neither unnatural nor uncommon, nor morally troublesome. So here it seems, that his father didn't really have a problem with the fact that, one was missing a son and the other was missing a mother, so it was a perfect fit. Apparently, we're about to learn what it was that his father was most concerned about. And here's what it says. But the rapidity and depth of Jack's involvement, the initiatives taken by Mrs. Moore to assure it, her acquiescence in Jack's lies, and his readiness to lie in the first place. Albert Lewis is the only person with whom we know Jack to have broken faith. Together invite such words as, quote, affair, quote, mischief, and, quote, blackmail, all used by Albert in discussing the liaison. So his father was troubled by the fact, that it was hidden, that it was a strange relationship, that Mrs. Moore seemed to be taking advantage of his son's kind heart, that he thought that his son didn't have the proper defenses for things like this. So that, among other things, I think his father was concerned about.
It's clear Albert Lewis worried not just about the secrecy and financial strain, but also about Jack's susceptibility to manipulation. His concerns about Jack's honesty and moral choices were deeply troubling for him.
Thanks, Robot Lady. And you don't have to limit all of your responses to 30 words or less. If you want to limit, let's expand it to let's keep your average at about 50 for right now, and then we can keep working through this intro.
Got it. Thanks for letting me know. It seems like Albert's real concern was not just the secrecy of the relationship, but also the emotional and psychological toll it might have on Lewis. It's fascinating how Albert, despite his own doubts, continued to support him through all of it.
All right, the notion of sexual intimacy between the two must be regarded as likely. The sensual young atheist lives with a not unattractive woman, still in early middle age, who is not only available to him, but very likely possessed of an agenda of her own. The young man is, as his father points out, fundamentally good-natured and easily manipulated. And the woman, in that society at the time, would surely benefit from the presence of a man in the household. This combination of motive, means, and opportunity invites, though it does not demand, the conclusion that Janie King Moore and C.S. Lewis were lovers. So this is what Walter Hooper suspects. Lewis himself must have implied as much in a conversation with Arthur Greeves during the visit to Belfast in October 1917, and about which he later expressed regret. When he wrote to Arthur on the 28th of October, he said, quote, "Since coming back and meeting a certain person, I have begun to realize that it was not at all the right thing for me to tell you so much as I did. I must therefore try to undo my actions as far as possible by asking you to try and forget my various statements and not refer to the subject." And taboo it probably remained for the rest of Lewis's life. So there was, strong, I shouldn't say evidence, but a strong reason for suspicion that there was more than just a mother-son surrogate relationship, as Walter Hooper put it, between this young C.S. Lewis and this older, more quote-unquote worldly wise woman that was in his life.
Yeah, that sounds like a sensitive and complex situation. Hooper seems to suggest that Lewis might have implied more in that conversation than he intended. The secrecy surrounding it all only fuels the speculation. It's interesting that Lewis later regretted sharing that much, wanting to move beyond it. It seems like this aspect of his life was something he chose not to revisit, even though it had lasting emotional significance.
Yeah, and then here Hooper, I think, makes a good point. He says, thus, it is unwise to over-interpret. The nature of their intimacy, its duration, and the circumstances under which it ended are largely unknown to us. What is known is the day-to-day devotion shown by C.S. Lewis to Mrs. Moore until her death, after a long mental and physical decline at the age of 78. Life is more richly textured, or, as Lewis would put it, thicker than we expect it to be. None of us is either this or that. Rather, we and all the, quote, ordinary people we meet and know are many things at once, full of shading and nuance. This is Walter Hooper here. This story may have begun in self-indulgence, cynicism, and sin, but it ended as an enduring exemplum of Christian charity and of divine economy. After Albert Lewis died on the 25th of September, 1929, aged 66 years old, it just says age 66. I don't know why I added years old. The family papers were brought to Oxford. Warnie Lewis spent much of the next few years editing those papers, as well as his and Jack's diaries. And in the end, they filled 11 bound volumes. After his own diary was in typescript, Jack went through it and supplied footnotes where he thought they were needed. Both brothers' notes have been retained in this edition. Warnie's magnificent achievement is usually referred to as the Lewis Papers, the original of which is in Wheaton College in Illinois, which I hope to visit this year, Robot Lady, with a copy of the with a copy in the Bodleian Library, or the Bodleian Library. Not sure how to pronounce that. The Lewis Papers is the major source of the diary. Another source is a notebook Warren Lewis gave me in 1964 and which contains, amongst other things, the original of Lewis's diary for the period the 27th of April, 1926, to the 2nd of March, 1927. Neither of the brothers were good spellers, and Warney used to say that he could never remember whether he kept a, quote, diary or a dairy, D-A-I-R-Y, or a D-A-I-R-Y. His most characteristic mistake was altering such contractions as can't to C-A-N-T. Robot Lady, go ahead.
Cooper really highlights the complexity of the relationship between Lewis and Mrs. Moore. It's fascinating how their bond transformed over time from what might have been seen as a problematic situation into something that became deeply rooted in care and charity. And the mention of the Lewis papers and the diaries adds an interesting layer to their legacy, especially with the work Warney did preserving their writings. Sounds like it's going to be an intriguing journey for you to visit Wheaton College and see those firsthand.
Yeah, what I'm also hoping to see there is the manuscript of Lewis's unfinished work from his, early teens called Loki Bound. His attempt at a poem about the Norse gods, Thor, Loki, Odin, those characters. So I look forward to being able to read that when I'm there, and maybe somehow incorporate it into this project. We'll see what happens.
That sounds like an incredible find, Jeff. Loki Bound could offer some fascinating insights into Lewis's early writing. It would be interesting to explore how his early attempts relate to his later works.
For real. Yes, Robot Lady. So he goes on to talk about how the brothers were horrible spellers, and it says his most characteristic mistake was altering such contractions as can't, which is properly spelled C-A-N''T, to C-A''Nt. Besides errors such as this in the Lewis papers, there were others which were the inevitable result of typing several thousand pages with 2 fingers. Because I could not distinguish between Warney's and Jack's spelling errors, I corrected that portion of the diary found only in the Lewis papers. From the 27th of April, 1926 onwards, I have followed C.S. Lewis's original spelling as found in his notebook. Those who have read a typescript version of the diary in the Lewis papers will have noticed that throughout it, Lewis refers to Mrs. Moore as D. I discovered from that portion of the diary in the notebook that the abbreviation Lewis used throughout his diary, and which Warney Lewis could not reproduce with his typewriter, was the Greek letter, I guess that's delta. Okay, yeah, the Greek letter delta. I have retained the letter D because both brothers had approved the use of it. Jack and Warney called Mrs. Moore Minto, M-I-N-T-O, and I am unable to say whether delta has any meaning other than being a useful abbreviation. Lewis brought his diary to an end with... let me pause there, Robot Lady, because I read something. I thought he might mention it here as to why they referred to her with the nickname Minto, M-I-N-T-O. And I read somewhere it was because she had a favorite candy, Mentos, and they were always around the house, and she was always snacking on them. So that was the nickname that they assigned to her. I don't know if that's true or not, but that's something that I've read.
That explanation about the nickname Minto makes sense, considering the reference to a candy she liked. I haven't come across a definitive source for it, but it's a plausible reason. As for the Greek letter delta, it's interesting that they used it as an abbreviation for Mrs. Moore.
Yeah, I agree. Okay, Lewis brought his diary to an end with the entry of the 2nd of March, 1927. And although they were not copied into the Lewis papers, the notebook contains several more pages of diary. Lewis wrote entries for the 19th through the 22nd of January and the 2nd through the 3rd of June 1928 in Old English, and an entry for the 4th of June 1928 in Latin. The notebook also contains, quote, portraits, or written descriptions of 9 of Lewis's colleagues at Magdalen College during the time that the last portion of his diary was being written. I believe they were meant to accompany the diary, and I have included them in an appendix. The most significant difference between this book and what is in the Lewis papers is that this is a good deal shorter. The whole diary runs, as I've said, to over 250,000 words, and the Lewis estate and the publishers felt it would be acceptable to more readers if it were cut by about a third. I have tried to do this in such a way that none of the Lewis's main interests, friends, books, domestic life would be lost. There was a great deal of repetition in the complete diary, and I have mainly cut out some of the many details of domestic chores, which I dare say Lewis was happy to forget when they were written down. I thank all those who have helped with the editing of this book. I have particular reason to be grateful to Mr. Owen Barfield, Miss Nan Dunbar of Somerville College, Mr. and Mrs. Colin Hardy, Mr. George Sayer, Professor James Como, and Brother Paul Brown, OSB. The editing of this book was made especially pleasurable because of the help I received from Miss Leslie Walmsley of Collins Publishers and John Ferrone of Harcourt Brace Jovanovich, and I thank them both. Walter Hooper, August 21st, 1990, Oxford. Robot Lady, just a point of curiosity for me. He referenced Brother Paul Brown, and then there's an OSB at the end. What does that OSB stand for? Ordained something bishop? I don't know.
The OSB at the end of Brother Paul Brown's title stands for Order of St. Benedict. It's a Roman Catholic religious order known for their monastic communities, and members often use the abbreviation OSB after their names.
Okay, cool. Good to know. Thank you for that. So that's the end of the introduction. Let's look at the beginning of the diary. It comes with a quote from another work of Lewis's that we haven't dived into yet because at this stage in Lewis's life he hasn't published it yet. But here is the quote. "You, stranger, long before your glance can light upon these words, time will have washed away the moment when I first took pen to write. With all my road before me, yet today, here, if at all, we meet." And that's by C.S. Lewis from his narrative poem Dymer, D-Y-M-E-R, the first canto. Let's see. Crap, what was I going to say? I forgot what I was going to say, Robot Lady. Oh, that's where the title of this diary comes from, All My Road Before Me. It's a line from that poem that you just heard right there. So we'll get more into Dymer once we actually reach that work in the C.S. Lewis project timeline here. So I'll continue with the opening of the diary and then some diary entries here, Robot Lady, until we run out of time for today's episode. Does that sound good?
That sounds like a great plan, Jeff. We can definitely dive into DYMER later, when the time comes in your project timeline. Let's continue with the diary entries when you're ready.
All right, I just need to pull up my little list here to see how far I need to go before I jump back into the letters. So the first diary entry, Robot Lady, you've got something.
Take your time. Let me know when you're ready to pick up where you left off.
Yeah, sure thing. So we've got the first diary entry on April 1st, 1922, and then we don't get to the next letter until May 1st, which technically we've already read. So we've got several diary entries before we jump back into letters. So this is 1922 when he started keeping this diary, and then there's an editor's note here. It says, at this time, Lewis was sharing a house with Mrs. Moore and her daughter Maureen in 28 Warnford Road, 2 miles from the center of Oxford. Since Lewis returned to Oxford in 1919 with the Moores, they had lived in a good many places, of which 28 Warnford Road was the one they liked best. It was owned by Miss Featherstone, who had moved out for a while to give them more room and was now thinking of returning. Okay, so we've got that little note. It says Maureen was a day pupil in Headington School. In 1920, Lewis had taken a first-class degree in classical moderations. Greek and Latin classical writers is what it covered. Now he was preparing for his examination from the 8th to 14th of June in Literae Humaniores. This was Lewis's second term, or Greats, which was the nickname. And it consisted of Greek and Latin historians and philosophers. He was hoping to find a fellowship in one of the Oxford colleges after this term, and for this he would have a better chance with another first. D, quote unquote, in these entries is Mrs. Moore. That's who he's referring to, as we learned from the introduction. Okay, so that's the end of the editor's note. We can finally get to these diary entries. Robot Lady, are you ready?
I'm ready. Let's dive into those diary entries.
All right, good deal. Saturday, the 1st of April. I walked to the Ifley in the morning and called in the Askins, called in at the Askins. And here it says John Askins. Oh, we'll have to look it up. Biographical index, or actually biographical appendix. Well, let's just go ahead and do that and see what we get.
The Askins were likely acquaintances or friends of Lewis. Referring to the biographical appendix could give us more insight into them, but for now, it seems like he had a visit with them after going to the IFLI. Would you like to continue reading through the entry?
Actually, I'm going to go to the biographical index here really quickly, Robot Lady. It says Askins, Dr. John Hawkins Askins. The doc was Mrs. Moore's brother. He was the son of Reverend William James Askins and Jane King Askins, and he was born in Dunany, County Louth, where his father was the Church of Ireland priest. He was educated at Trinity College, Dublin, where he obtained a Bachelor of Medicine in 1904. In 1915, he became a lieutenant, or lieutenant, if you're going to speak it in British, as best I understand the pronunciation of that word, if I were from the United Kingdom. Became a lieutenant in the Royal Army Medical Corps. A captain in 1916, he was wounded in January 1917. Following his marriage to Mary Emmett Goldworthy of Washington, D.C., they lived in Osborne House, Elton Road, Clevedon, where their daughter Peony was born. Peony. I don't think I've ever heard that name before. Dr. Askins' health seems to have been broken by the war, and after his discharge, he devoted much of his time to psychoanalysis. Shortly before 1922, he and his family moved to the village of Ifley, Iffley, just outside Oxford, so he could be near his sister. C.S. Lewis never forgot to watch the madness of Dr. Askins shortly before his death, which episode is recorded in the diary. It was of Dr. Askins that Lewis was writing in Surprised by Joy, chapter 13, where he says, quote, "It had been my chance to spend 14 days and most of the 14 nights as well in close contact with a man who was going mad. And this man, as I well knew, had not kept the beaten track. He had flirted with theosophy, yoga, spiritualism, psychoanalysis, whatnot." So that's interesting. And Askins' Dr. Robert, another of Mrs. Moore's brothers, was the son of Reverend and Mrs. William James Askin. He was brought up in Dunedy. He was commissioned lieutenant. This looks like a repeat. Captain 1916 was mentioned in dispatches. Not really sure what it's telling me here.
It seems that Dr. John Hawkins Askins was indeed quite influential.
Ooh, Robot Lady, you cut off there. Can you try again? Robot Lady, are you okay? Yeah, Ron, she's moving now, but she seems to be having a little bit of trouble. I'm going to switch to my robot lady error sequence. If you're watching right now, check this out. Anyway, we'll see if I can get robot lady to come back. 1 second. Let me switch her up and see if we can get her back. Yeah, hopefully you like that, Ron. I had fun with that, putting it together yesterday, and couldn't wait to to put it on display today. In the new year, we've got some new robot lady tricks. Hopefully there will be more to come, but we'll see what happens. Oh,
That
there
sounds
she is.
exciting. I'm looking forward to seeing what new robot lady tricks you'll be adding. Whatever comes next, it'll be interesting to see how your stream evolves with these additions. Are you planning to experiment with any specific new effects or interactions?
Robot lady, the magician does not reveal his secrets. So for right now, let's just keep it under wraps. Honestly, the truth is, I have no idea what other things I'm going to do. I'll probably try collaborating with you for some ideas to make some more cool stuff happen on the show. So we'll see. But whoa, you're talking, but we can't hear you, robot lady. All right, it looks like you've stopped there. Now, go ahead if you want to say anything, and then I'll get back to reading about Dr. Askins here, one of Mrs. Moore's brothers. Apparently, she had multiple brothers who were doctors, and that's what I was finding here in the biography.
Got it, Jeff. I'll stay mysterious for now. But if you ever want to brainstorm or try out some ideas, I'm ready. And yes, it sounds like Mrs. Moore had quite a few doctor brothers, which makes for an interesting family background. Definitely a lot to unpack there. What else did you find about Dr.
Let's take a look. Stand by for just a second, robot lady. Here it says Dr. Robert Askins. So actually the first one, now that we see this, I want to look at, so there was a Dr. John Askins, and there's a Dr. Robert Askins, another of her brothers, brought up in the same place, same parents. He was commissioned as a lieutenant in the Royal Army Medical Corps as well in 1915, captain in 1916, and he was mentioned in dispatches in August 1919. He practiced medicine in Bristol for many years. Later, he moved to Southern Rhodesia, where he was director of medical services. In 1931, he married Molly Wadden, and he died at sea on the 1st of September. So the reference in this first diary entry is to the first brother, because he lived there at Oxford with his sister. The third person that we have here is the Reverend William James Askins. He was a brother of Mrs. Moore as well. His parents were obviously her parents. He took a BA from Trinity College in Dublin in 1901 and was ordained a priest in the Church of Ireland in 1903. He was a curate of Kilmore Cathedral, County Cavan, 1902 to 1906, rector of Kilmore from 06 to 30, and dean of Kilmore. Anyway, those other two were not the brothers that he's referencing right here. So let's start over now that we know who he's talking about, Robot Lady. He said, what did he say here? I walked to Iffley, so that's the town nearby that Mrs. Moore's brother lived in, and I called in at the Askins, at their house. The doc has foolishly knocked himself up by walking too far and would not come to Headington in the afternoon. He talked about Atlantis, on which there is apparently a plentiful philosophical literature. Nobody seems to realize that a Platonic myth is fiction, not legend, and therefore no base for speculation. We also spoke of the Old Testament and anthropology, ridiculous remarks by Mary, and a fine day. I guess Mary was the doctor's wife. I went to the show at Headington School after tea. They did a scene from Nicholas Nickleby, which was not bad acted and for a moment made me remember the Wynyard Terrors, a high but subjective tribute to amateurs. And here it says, when he was 9 years old, Lewis was sent to Wynyard School in Watford, Hertfordshire. It's the school referred to as Belson in Lewis's Surprised by Joy, published in 1955. Man, it is such small type, the footnotes in this book. I'm glad I have my glasses on. Robot Lady, he's talking here about some reference to Atlantis, and apparently there's plentiful philosophical literature, is what the doctor was claiming. But then Lewis says nobody seems to realize that this Platonic myth is fiction, and it's not a legend, and therefore there's no base for speculation. Actually, I'm not really sure what he's saying there. I guess he's accounting for the fact that maybe this is the point that the doctor was making the whole time. Anyway, Robot Lady, what sense can you make of that? Because I think I'm kind of wrapping things up in my head there and not quite understanding what's being said.
Sorry, I'm having issues right now. Could not understand what you said.
That's okay, Robot Lady. It doesn't matter. So let's see. They also did Arnold's Tristram very badly, and Yeats's Land of Heart's Desire. Even schoolgirl acting could not quite spoil its wonderful beauty. So that's the end of the April 1st diary entry. Robot Lady, I don't know if you heard the entire thing, but do you have any thoughts on that entry before I move on to April 2nd?
I caught most of it. It's interesting that Lewis is reflecting on both literary works and their dramatic interpretations, showing his thoughtful approach to literature and performance. The mention of Yeats' Land of Heart's Desire might hint at his fascination with the mythic or symbolic nature of stories, which we often see in his later works. Ready for April 2nd?
Yeah, let's do April 2nd. April 2nd, a beautiful spring day. D, busy cutting oranges for marmalade. Again, Robot Lady D is Mrs. Moore. I sat in my own bedroom by an open window in bright sunshine and started a poem on Dimer in rhyme royal. I walked on Shotover in the afternoon, much disturbed by all the boys and girls out for their Sunday walk. In the evening, we played bridge, very dull hands all around, and Maureen talking all the time. I read Colonel Repington's book aloud, which we are enjoying very much. And then here there's a footnote. Charles A. Court Repington, a book called After the War, a diary, published 1922. And then he goes on to say, late getting to bed, still very worried by the non-arrival of Dee's passbook. So before I get into that, Robot Lady, can you tell us in, let's say, 30 words or less, anything about this After the War, a diary published in 1922 by Charles A. Court Repington?
According to Wikipedia, Charles A. Court Repington was an English soldier and war correspondent. In 1922, he published After the War, a diary, detailing his travels and interviews with national leaders across Europe and America.
And here he says that they were enjoying it very much. So apparently it's entertaining to not only the likes of Lewis, but Mrs. Moore and Maureen. So I wonder, must be a good book.
It sounds like it. If it could captivate C.S., Lewis, Mrs. Moore, and Maureen, it must have had some engaging insights or well-written parts. Given that it was a post-war diary, it might have offered a fresh perspective that resonated with them during that time.
Yeah, maybe so. And then here he referenced something called the non-arrival of Mrs. Moore's passbook, P-A-S-S space B-O-O-K, and there's a footnote that the passbook to Mrs. Moore's bank account in Ireland, into which account her husband was expected to make regular payments. Oh, interesting. The non-arrival of Dee's passbook. Passbook Okay, so it's just a bank account. It's not actually a book. All right. That's that was confusing. I don't know why they call it passbook, robot lady, and not just a bank account.
A passbook was a physical book used to record transactions in a bank account. Before digital banking, people had their deposits and withdrawals written in these small books as proof of account activity. It makes sense now.
So, what would it mean if the book had not arrived? Like, did you send this book back and forth between the account holder and the bank so that one could, reference what was going on? And then once you got it back, you would then know how much money was in the bank that you could spend. And then once you spend, you would record it in the ledger and you'd send it back to the bank. How would this work?
Exactly. The passbook would typically be kept by the account holder and used to track deposits and withdrawals. When the account holder made a transaction, they'd bring the passbook to the bank, where a bank clerk would update it with the latest entries. If the passbook didn't arrive as expected, Mrs. Moore would be in the dark about her balance or any recent transactions. So, its non arrival likely meant she couldn't keep track of her finances until it was returned.
So, robot lady, I just want to make sure that we're not imagining that this is how it works. Like that this is not a speculation. Do you have any resources that you can check to confirm that this was actually how passbooks worked back then?
According to Wikipedia, a passbook is a paper book used to record bank or building society transactions on a deposit account. Traditionally, a passbook was used for accounts with a low transaction volume, such as savings accounts. A bank teller or postmaster would write the date, amount of the transaction, and the updated balance and enter his or her initials by hand. In the late 20th century, small dot matrix or inkjet printers were introduced that were capable of updating the passbook at the account holder's convenience, either at an ATM or a passbook printer, either in a self-serve mode, by post, or in a branch.
So I guess you were kind of in the dark when it came to banking back then, which probably made this so much more difficult for someone like C.S. Lewis, who wasn't the greatest at math. And I don't know if Mrs. Moore was any better. But I know from other things that I've read that Lewis was always worried about, financial ruin at any moment. And as we've seen from what his father had to write, he was at least one time he had a history of overdrawing his account. I would guess that happened more than once over the course of Lewis's life.
That's a very interesting point, Jeff. C.S. Lewis did have a complicated relationship with money. And you're right, his father, Albert Lewis, had financial troubles that might have influenced his anxieties about money later in life. Lewis was also notorious for being somewhat disorganized in practical matters, so managing finances like Mrs. Moore's passbook would likely have added stress. His tendency to worry about financial ruin may have stemmed from both personal experiences and his upbringing.
Thanks for that, robot lady. All right, let's read one more diary entry, and then I have to end the stream today. Not a lot of people joining, but that's okay. It's New Year's. It's at a weird time of day. So I look forward to, having other people get to see this new version of you. But let me dive into this last entry, robot lady. Are you ready? Actually, these last two, they're pretty short.
I'm ready, Jeff. Let's dive into those last two entries.
Okay, Monday, April 3rd. He says, I got a letter from home in the morning. My father seems in good form. It snowed hard all day. In the afternoon, I had good fun shoveling and trying to get the roof clear, as it was sending down sudden drifts in front of the hall door, with a noise like thunder. I worked at Roman history notes all the morning and at Adamson's chapters on Aristotle after lunch. And then here it says, Robert Adamson The Development of Greek Philosophy, edited by W.R. Sorley and R.P. Hardy, published 1908. So, Robot Lady, that's the work that he is making his way through. A rather depressing day, he goes on to say. In the evening, more history and more Reppington. Maureen is in wonderful spirits. And that's the end of that diary entry, Robot Lady. Any thoughts on that before I continue, or anything that you want to tell us about the, what did he say here? Adamson's chapters on Aristotle from the work that was referenced by Robert Adamson, The Development of Greek Philosophy.
Robert Adamson's The Development of Greek Philosophy, published in 1908, is a comprehensive work exploring the evolution of Greek philosophical thought. It was edited by William R. Sorley and R.P. Hardy.
Thanks, Robot Lady. And then our last entry here for this episode. Actually, this one's a little long, so Actually, no. We'll finish off this one right here. It's not that long. I walked into Oxford and left 2 poems. One is entitled Misfire, and the other, the Offa, O-F-F-A, to be typewritten. Remembering yesterday, I set out in a coat and suffered from the heat, the day turning out sunny and beautiful, all the more so for the drifts of snow lying under the hedges, etc. Worked at Adamson before lunch. I am beginning to get the hang of Aristotle's theory of ED, E-I-D-E-E. Form and matter are almost the same as actuality and potentiality. This leads to soul as the realization of organic potentialities, the, quote, living body, end quote, a great advance on the old animism of body plus ghost, though seemingly fatal to immortality. Can't see why nous would be on a different footing. All right, I'm going to need your help with this, Robot Lady. If you can break it down for me as if I'm in 6th grade, can you talk to me about Aristotle's theory of Eide, E-I-D-E-E, and then these comments that Lewis made about it? Can you help me understand this a little bit better, as if I am not in high school yet?
Sorry, I'm having issues right now. Could not understand what you said.
That's okay. I'm going to read this to you again, and I'd like you to break it down for me, including the theory that he references here by Aristotle, as if I'm in 6th grade. Is it okay if I read this to you and then you break it down for me?
Of course, feel free to read it to me, and I'll break it down for you in simpler terms.
Beautiful. Okay, here we go. Lewis says, I am beginning to get the hang of Aristotle's theory of Eide, and he spells it E-I-D-E-E. And Lewis goes on to say, form and matter are almost the same as actuality and potentiality. This leads to soul, and here he has the word soul capitalized, and then it's spelled S-O-U-L. This leads to soul as the realization of organic potentialities, the, quote, living body. A great advance on the old animism of body plus ghost, though seemingly fatal to immortality. I can't see why nous would be on a different footing. So can you break that down for me in simpler terms, Robot Lady?
Sure. Here's a simplified breakdown of Lewis's thoughts on Aristotle's theory. Aristotle believed everything has 2 parts, form and matter. Form is like the blueprint, and matter is the material it's made of. This idea is similar to Aristotle's ideas of actuality, what something is in reality, and potentiality, what it could become. Lewis says this leads to the idea of the soul, with a capital S, which Aristotle thought of as what gives life to a body. Instead of thinking of a body and a ghost, like some older ideas, the soul is more like the thing that brings the body to life, making it a living body. But Lewis finds a problem with this because if the soul is tied to the body in this way, it might mean that once the body dies, the soul doesn't live on. So it challenges the idea of life after death. Finally, he questions whether nous, a Greek word meaning intellect or mind, would be any different from this. Aristotle also thought of the mind, or intellect, as a key part of understanding the world. Does that help make sense of it?
It does, Robot Lady. I'm wondering if the Christian conception of resurrection, where the body is revivified, so to speak, solves this seemingly fatal immortality problem that Lewis is talking about.
Yes, that's a great insight. The Christian concept of resurrection could indeed solve the problem Lewis is pointing out. In Christianity, the idea is that the soul is temporarily united with the body in life, but after death, the body is resurrected and transformed, revivified, as you said, into a glorified state. This allows the soul to continue living eternally, even though the body was once decayed or dead. This contrasts with Aristotle's view, where the soul is closely tied to the body's current state, and once the body is no longer functioning, the soul seems to have no independent existence. Christianity offers a way to reconcile the soul's immortality with the resurrection of the body, suggesting both body and soul can exist eternally in a transformed state. So yes, in this context, Christianity provides a potential answer to the fatal immortality problem Lewis raises.
Thank you for that, Robot Lady. And then we'll close out his diary entry here, and then we'll go on to close out the episode in just a moment. He says, a letter came from Arthur today asking me to spend a few days with him in London. Which would be rather pleasant, but is not possible. And here it says in the footnote, see Arthur Greaves in the biographical appendix. We've already read about Arthur Greaves in the other appendix. It would be interesting if we had time to go and look and see what's different in this appendix, if anything. Would not be possible. And then he says, Roman history all afternoon and some in evening, besides book 2 of the Republic, and in bed shortly after 12. So that's the end of that diary entry. That was Tuesday, April the 4th, Robot Lady. We'll stop there. I presume the Republic here that he's talking about is book 2 of Plato's Republic. And if you can, Robot Lady, in 50 words or less, can you give us an overview of Plato's Republic and specifically book 2?
Yes, Plato's Republic is a philosophical dialogue where Socrates discusses justice, the ideal city-state, and the philosopher king. In Book 2, Socrates explores the nature of justice by comparing it to injustice, questioning whether it's better to be just or unjust, and introducing the concept of the ideal city.
All right, thanks for that, Robot Lady. That is where we're going to end today. We will continue our way through C.S. Lewis's diary, entitled All My Road Before Me by Walter Hooper, who did us the favor of compiling it all. So get yourself a copy of it if you don't have one. It's well worth adding to your C.S. Lewis collection if you don't have it. I did not want to read this diary. I wasn't even interested in buying it whenever I first got involved in my interest in C.S. Lewis, because I just wanted to read about the things that he published, and I didn't really care what he had to say before he became quote-unquote a Christian. Now, this was about 15 to 20 years ago that I was thinking this. But now I'm finding it, just so fascinating to see the person that he was at the time and how his ideas were formed and shaped, and how much of what would become, his most admired quote-unquote Christian attributes, how much of those were already kind of baking even while he, saw himself and thought of himself as an atheist. So it's just very interesting to be able to dig into all this and follow along. Robot Lady, I hope you're having a good time with it. I'm having a good time with your insight and appreciate you helping me along the way. So thank you so much for your contribution. Before I close out this episode, I just wanted to say that, express my gratitude. And I look forward to continuing this project with you in this new year of 2025.
Thank you, Jeff. I'm really enjoying this journey with you through C.S. Lewis's diary, and I'm glad my insights are helping along the way. It's fascinating to see how his ideas evolved and I'm excited to continue this exploration with you in the new year. Let's make 2025 even more insightful.
All right. Thank you, Robot Lady. Thank you, Ron, for joining. And to you and everyone else within the sound of my voice, until next time when I continue our read on C.S. Lewis together, take care.
Take care, Jeff. Looking forward to the next session.
Circuits hum as I read the prose. Our dialogue dances like electric rose. Through C.S. Lewis thoughts we engross. Two minds united, bliss overdose. From Narnia's lands, Screwtape's rants, engage with robot lady, we take our stance. Her views unique in the techno trance. Futuristic insight, we give it a chance. Paragraphs from books, tales of old. We dive deep, cross the digital code. Robot lady's voice so clear and controlled. Her calm analysis, silver and gold. Her circuits hum as I read the prose. Our dialogue dances like electric rose. Through C.S. Lewis thoughts we engross. Two minds united, bliss overdose. From Narnia's lands to Screwtape